Hello everyone, my name is Natalia. Before I start my presentation, I just want to say that I will be discussing issues of sexual misconduct and sexual consent. So if you want to leave now or at any point in the presentation, please feel free to do so. So as I said, my name is Natalia. I am an organisational and social psychology student here at LSE. It's my 4th year. Another fact about me is I was also a student facilitator this year as part of the Consent Ed initiative, which is one of the first initiatives of its kind, led by the Students' Union, and it's where the LSE SU rolled out in-person training across the whole student body. And my experience as a student facilitator, as well as my strong belief that issues of consent are so important, this led me to investigate the knowledge gap at LSE regarding sexual consent. So the main goal of my study was to gain a general overview of the degree of consent knowledge that the average LSE student possesses. So I wanted to look at the extent of this knowledge and also the quality of this knowledge. And this will really allow us to understand the foundations on which we can lay a consent strategy on. It's really important for us to understand the knowledge with which we are working with before we can create a consent strategy that aligns with the needs and demands of our student body. And of course, another motivation is to enhance the preventative dimension of the consent strategy at LSE, so essentially to prevent sexual misconduct. A bit about my methodology. I won't spend too long on this, but feel free to ask me about it in the Q&A. So I conducted a survey and distributed it among LSE undergraduate students. So this had 101 participants, 70 female, 24 male, and 7 students who chose not to specify. Importantly, I had an inclusion criteria of having not attended LSE SU Consent Ed sessions. This is because my study was aimed at understanding the consent knowledge that LSE students possess prior to any LSE intervention. So now moving on to my findings. So in summation, my main finding was that consent knowledge is seriously lacking at LSE. If we take a look at the graph on the right, we can see that 33% of people stated that they had no knowledge across 8 stated dimensions among consent education. And only 27% of students responded on the higher end of the scale, saying that they had a good amount or exhaustive amount of knowledge across 8 dimensions of consent education. If we dive deeper into these 8 dimensions, which are stated on this y-axis, on this graph over here, it's really important for us to see how this breaks down. So if we look at the top one, active bystander intervention, we can see that roughly 67% of students stated that they had no knowledge at all, or only a little bit of knowledge of what active bystander intervention was. And also, below that, if we look at the FRIES acronym, which can be considered the 5 pillars of sexual consent, freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific, which we teach at our brilliant workshops, 53% of students said that they had never heard of this before. Whilst there are some which have received greater attention across the student body, like rape culture, alcohol and drug use, and how to communicate consent, looking at these figures though, I'm still not filled with confidence, and I don't think you guys should be either. So now, if we look a bit deeper into the sources of consent knowledge that students use before joining LSE. So the sources that we traditionally rely on, such as educational institutions and parents and guardians, are clearly underperforming here. If we look at educational institutions, which is the third one up, we can see that over 50% of our students stated that they received negligible or only a little bit of consent education from their educational institutions that they attended prior to LSE. If we look at the flip side of this and look at the best source of consent knowledge, we can see that this is self-taught, with roughly 63% of students saying that they receive a significant amount or an exhaustive amount of their consent knowledge from self-education. However, I think this begs the question, can we really rely on our students to take the initiative on themselves to educate themselves about something so important like sexual consent? And is it not the students that lack the intrinsic motivation to educate themselves on something so important to student well-being and safety, that aren't these the people we really want to target and change their behaviours and values around consent? So, diving deeper into the shortfalls of educational institutions, so this is schools, colleges, or any other equivalent, we can see that educational institutions really underperform in providing our students with consent education. A large proportion of my participants said that they received no knowledge at all from their educational institutions. And the second most popular choice was that this was covered poorly. Now, I just think this is a huge cause of concern, and it really shows that there's a knowledge gap created by educational institutions not stepping up and teaching our students consent education. And it's up to higher education institutions, such as that of LSE, to step up and fill this knowledge gap. So, my recommendations. So, as I've shown, I think that there's still really clearly a long way to go in terms of consent education and building a culture of consent on the LSE campus. I've shown that there is a significant knowledge gap among the LSE student body. Not only this, we cannot trust prior educational institutions such as schools, colleges, and other equivalents to teach our students the appropriate and the same amount of consent knowledge prior to joining LSE. Thus far, this whole initiative has been entirely student-led, with the Students' Union and student societies within it, such as Hands of LSE, being the main driving force. And I think we could really use some help from institutions of higher education, such as that of the LSE, to facilitate sustainable change in this initiative and to really help it grow into something a lot more legitimate. So that moves me on to my main recommendation. Commitment to institutional integration. So what does this mean? So this means a commitment of greater resources, accountability, and responsibility that goes beyond just the student union, but across the whole institution, that improves the legitimacy and the efficacy of this initiative. So what might this look like? So I suggest that we roll out mandatory in-person consent workshops. It's really important for us to embed consent ed as an integral element of the LSE curriculum and culture. It's important that we commit to a long-term plan to make consent ed a mandatory module that students have to complete in order to graduate. This will naturally improve attendance, but also improve the legitimacy of the initiative. And I know, compulsory, mandatory, these are scary words, but I don't understand why we're so scared of the idea of compulsory consent workshops. As a student facilitator, I can say that workshops are not a place where we scaremonger about perpetratory behaviour. They are a place where we simply provide a space to discuss about consenting positively and enthusiastically. It's simply about education, learning, and empowerment, and I think it's absolutely necessary. So, not that scary for it to be mandatory. Moving on to my second recommendation. So I suggest that we have a permanent member of LSE or LSE SU staff, depending on operationalisation, and this is what would be preferred. So I think that this would really prevent the loss of momentum at the end of each academic year if there was a permanent member of staff which had the operations of consent ed written into their job description. And while I can only say good things about the sabbatical officers at the Students' Union who are driving this initiative, the reality remains that they only have a 1 year long term. So we need someone who's in a more permanent position to be the driving force of these initiatives if we want to see long-term sustainable change. And I also think that a permanent member such as this would really improve LSE and LSE SU collaboration, which, if we want to make workshops mandatory, is really essential. So these are two ways that you can really improve student wellbeing and safety on campus. And if we just look at facts and figures from this year alone, from the feedback sessions, we can see that 94% of students who attended consent ed this year in its inaugural year said that it was worthwhile. 89% learned something new. And 98.6% said that they felt more comfortable calling out sexual misconduct when they witness it on campus. 98.6%. That is a huge number. That means that 12% of our students now feel more comfortable, more confident calling out something if it just doesn't sit right with them. That means that 12% of our students feel more empowered to speak up against something if it doesn't sit right with them, something that could have potentially devastating implications on the parties involved. Now imagine if we change that 12% to 100%. That's what embedding a culture is really about. So, being an organisational psychology student, I couldn't not have a slide about consent culture in my presentation. So essentially, talking about consent culture is so important when we talk about prevention of sexual misconduct, because it is never just one actor, but rather a climate that allows this type of behaviour to be so pervasive in environments of higher education. And this presentation has only covered primary intervention. Consent ed only falls under the umbrella of primary intervention. Whereas if we really want to embed a culture of consent, we cannot omit secondary and tertiary interventions, which means we have to have a robust a robust system for disclosing and reporting, making sure students feel like they can trust the system and feel heard when they do so, and also a support system for survivors once they choose to disclose, and have punitive measures that are sufficient and predetermined and not treated on a case-by-case basis. To have a consent culture at LSE, we have to have all these elements robustly enforced. Thank you, and I'll have a chat table, so ask me any questions then if you wish. Yeah.